Welcome, everybody. I'm Abbie Goldberg, a professor in psychology at Clark University, and also the editor of the second edition of the SAGE Encyclopedia of LGBTQ Studies, which we are celebrating tonight in the first of two really fabulous panels related to LGBT issues. So I'm really excited to get started. But I first want to kind of orient everybody and also talk a little bit about what you can expect today and also after today. So first, thank you to SAGE Publications and UMass Stonewall Center for co-sponsoring today's really special event. I will let the panelists introduce themselves briefly, but first I wanted to let you know that you can all leave questions for the panelists in the Q&A. You will get an email after today's session with a recording of the session, as well as the entries, the encyclopedia entries that are associated with some of the panelists. Some of the panelists have written entries for this encyclopedia. And you'll also get a really useful and comprehensive resource list that we have contributed to. I'll also just let you know that we have a second panel on March 28th, same time, 7 to 8:30 Eastern, on trans resistance, resilience, and self-reliance, another set of really wonderful panelists. So before we kind of dive into today's questions, which I will ask and select panelists will respond to, I'm just going to have the panelists introduce themselves. So I think we'll go in alphabetical order, last name. So we can start. I don't know where it is on anyone's screen, but with Jaymes Black.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jaymes Black. I use all pronouns, so use any pronoun when referring to me. I am the president and CEO of Family Equality. I am in DC, but I'm coming to you today from a hotel room in New York. And I am a parent, excuse me, I'm a mother of 9-year-old twins, and I'm a native Texan. But my wife and I moved from Texas in 2022 to the East Coast due to the climate in Texas. And we decided that even though we were native Texans and we really wanted to raise our children there, that it was not the environment that that was healthy for our kids or our family. And so now we are in DC. And so this is the subject that we're talking about tonight, schools, is really important to me. So I'm so happy to be here. Thanks, Abbie.
I think I'm next.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll jump in. Hi, everybody. My name is Maru Gonzalez. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an assistant professor and youth development specialist at North Carolina State University. And my work focuses on youth development with an emphasis on youth activism, storytelling, and LGBTQ+ youth belonging across school, familial, and community contexts, including youth serving organizations like 4-H. I'm delighted to be here, especially among so many giants in the field whose work I deeply respect and admire. So thank you, Dr. Goldberg and Dr. Beeman, for having me here tonight, and thank you all for being here.
Okay, I was waiting to see, Abbie, if you were going to go or if I should go. So I'll go.
I already introduced myself.
Like, alphabet's hard. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Greytak. My pronouns are she and her. I'm currently the director of research at the American Civil Liberties Union and also adjunct faculty at CUNY Brooklyn College School of Education. But most importantly, and Jaymes put this up front, is that I'm also a parent and in the New York City School District and a failed candidate for our community education board, like you to know. And I also wanted to just thank Abbie and Jenny for having us here today, and really excited to be with you all today and sharing the proverbial stage with sort of these giants in the field.
My next. I think P is next.
P is next.
I'm Elizabethe Payne. I'm director of the Queering Education Research Institute. My research looks at teacher experiences working with LGBT students, teacher experiences of professional development, queer kids in schools, and also anti-bullying policy and other LGBT education policies at state and federal levels. Very happy to be here with you all tonight. And it's been great to be a part of the SAGE Encyclopedia, and look forward to the discussion.
I'm Stephanie and Shelton. I am an associate professor of educational research and the director of diversity for the College of Education at the University of Alabama. My background, I was formerly a high school teacher, and I do extensive work with high school teachers, especially in relationship to anti-LGBTQ plus legislation. And that work has always been situated in the Deep South, in the Bible Belt. And so I live in Alabama. I'm currently physically in Florida. So all the various hotspots, I work with teachers and students and in my classrooms.
Thank you all so much, especially for adding just some of those personal elements that make this work particularly relevant and meaningful to you. So our first question is, and just to, folks watching know, different panelists will respond to different questions. Not everyone will respond to every question, but really the first question is, what does the landscape in schools across the United States look like right now for LGBTQ youth, parents, teachers, and administrators, and specifically in states like Texas, Florida, and so on?
You want to take that, Abbie?
So we've got Stephanie, Emily, and Jaymes who can pipe in. Should be on.
Okay, this is Jaymes. I'll pipe in. So I want to go back a bit first. Is in 2001, the Human Rights Watch published a report called "Hatred in the Hallways: Violence and Discrimination Against LGBT Students in Schools." And so this report 23 years ago found rampant bullying and discrimination in schools across the country. And the purpose was to urge policymakers and administrators to make changes. And so while we've seen some progress, what I wanted to point out is that 23 years later, what we saw in that report, those issues are still happening. So not only do we have the so-called no homo promo laws that I think led to much of that documented bullying, we now have our students contending with social media bullying and increased level of curriculum censorship, forced outing of students in states like Florida and Texas. And so when we think about the landscape, what we're hearing at Family Quality, families are worried, the teachers are worried, and we were all worried, and we're hearing heartbreaking stories out of Florida. And in fact, one of the most, I think, heartbreaking stories I heard is about a student who could not talk about his two dads in school, or talk about his a presentation of his vacation with his two dads, and had to go to another room to do that presentation. And we're also seeing at Family Quality an uptick in straight-led households who are searching for community and resources due to the treatment of their queer students, their queer children in schools.
I'll add really quickly. Doris Santoro does some really profound work around pushing back against this idea of burnout, and instead describes it as demoralization. And I think that that's a pretty apt description of what I see happening in schools across these various regions. And while I work in the Deep South, I do want to accentuate this is a nationwide problem, and it's even arguably a global problem, because one of the things that I often encounter is people are like, oh, Alabama. And it's like, yes, absolutely Alabama, but this is not like, we don't have a lock on this. This is not exclusive. But the demoralization is very real. And it's one of those situations where part of what this concept talks about is it situates parents, teachers, administrators, students to have to do things they know are wrong. And then the internal effects that has on their physical beings, on their psyche. And so it's directly tied to teacher attrition, and it's directly tied to a great deal of the mental health, emotional health needs that continuously rise in schooling, both for youth and for educators. And I do, because I think that a lot of times, because this gets so much coverage in the media, in terms of statistics, which can be very powerful and useful, it also sometimes dehumanizes these issues. And so I do quite a bit of workshops and trainings to help schools and especially teachers understand like where the gray areas are, like where they can still do this work and not risk both their livelihood and their safety and the safety of their students. And there have been a number of instances where parents will have to pack their families up in the middle of the night and relocate to a different state. This is not just like a one-off thing. It's not, there's not a single example. There's multiple instances of this, or they'll have a child in the household who is extremely vulnerable. And so the rest of the family will stay behind and a parent will take that child to a place where they can be safer. But then there's also a lot of catastrophic loss for teachers. I talk to teachers who literally brush their hair out in handfuls because they're so anxious and upset about what it is that they're legally obligated to do versus what it is they know that they ought to do. And this has real implications for the safety of everybody in the school space. And so if nothing else, I want to accentuate, because I think there's a lot of teacher blaming that happens, and there are certainly teachers who are problematic, but a lot of these teachers really want to do this work and do it well and support and affirm these youth and their colleagues. And these legislative efforts, this landscape, make it impossible and dangerous to do so. And what ends up happening is everyone's hurt. The students are trying to serve are hurt, their colleagues are hurt, and then they are hurt. And this is both figuratively, but also literal physical hurt in terms of the implications of what's happening. And yes, Florida, yes, Texas, yes, Alabama, yes, Mississippi, but everywhere.
And just to sort of add on to the broader landscape of what's happening, I think obviously we're also aware of these unprecedented attacks on educational inclusion and the opposition that's really become emboldened and attacking on multiple fronts. But I think it's helpful always for me to remember that like this is not new. These fights, these tactics have like been used before, whether it's like 1970s with the Briggs Initiative in Florida, or the defeated efforts in California to prohibit gays and lesbians from working in schools, or the 80s with right here in New York City, they recalled this multicultural rainbow curriculum, mostly because there was very limited mentions of same-sex families, to the no promo homo laws that Jaymes was mentioning in the 80s and 90s. Like in some ways, like we know we're doing well, we're winning, because every time there's progress, like a sea change in culture, we see this backlash, right? And obviously no surprise to anyone here that the attacks are so tied right now to racial justice efforts as well. Not a coincidence. There's so little distance between those leading efforts to ban LGBTQ inclusion and those leading efforts to ban accurate history and discussions about racism. Often it's the same people behind those groups. But in terms of where we are for these bills, we're seeing like 3 types of bills: attacks against trans youth, whether it's healthcare, facilities, athletics, correct names and pronouns. And I just wanted to share, I just looked this up right before we started, that not only do 10 states currently have these laws right now, but since the beginning of 2024 alone, 28 new states have bills proposed around attacks against trans youth, specifically around school facilities. 254 bills are being proposed around sports, in LGBTQ confidentiality and care. 7 states force outing, promote outing of LGBTQ to their parents, and currently 50 bills are proposed, 50 more bills. And then we have curriculum and pedagogy, right, which we're all often talking about, book banning and limiting speech and don't say gay laws. And as of the fall, 11 states had those types of bans. But also don't forget that 6 states require LGBTQ curricular inclusion. But the trend obviously is not towards the positive, it's towards the negative. And just in 2024, there were 50 new negative bills proposed. But I do want to say that it's not all doom and gloom, because although the negative laws really have the momentum right now, there's some new bills that are being pushed forward in like New York and Maryland, the Freedom to Read Act, and the Federal Book Bans Act. So I just want to uplift that there are some different opportunities now for us. I know we'll talk more about this later, but for us to also continue to look forward and not just trying to stop what's right in front of our faces.
Thank you so much. And I just will note, I do have a couple of reports with the Williams Institute at UCLA on the effects of the Don't Say Gay law, and I will post those links in the chat in a couple of minutes. But for those of you who do advocacy work, what are your organizations doing to fight against anti-LGBTQ legislation and to provide resources and support for LGBTQ families? So we've got Emily, Jaymes, and Stephanie, if you want.
Okay, I'll chime in. So family equality, excuse me, we're looking at it from 3 fronts: legislation, resources and safety, and community spaces. And so from a legislative front, for example, speaking of Don't Say Gay, we filed a lawsuit against the Florida Department of Education because of Don't Say Gay. And so that was something that we're incredibly proud of. And while I can't speak a whole lot about the lawsuit, it really did shine a light on the problems and the impact and what students and teachers and parents are going through in Florida. Also on the legislative front, our policy team is partnering with state groups across the country, both to fight LGBTQ+ censorship laws, but also to push inclusive curriculum. From a resource and safety perspective, Stephanie, I'm so happy that you mentioned how people are picking up in the middle of the night and moving to other states. And we are seeing that too. And excuse me, one of the things that we're doing is we're developing technology to address that. We have heard from families in Texas who are packing up everything that they have without a plan, without any sort of plan of where they're going to go other than the state, but not a home, not a community. But the only thing that they are truly worried about, of course, as any parent, is keeping their child safe. And they are driving, for instance, from Texas or Dallas, for example, 20 hours to Los Angeles just to feel safe. And so we thought, you know what, there's a problem that we're going to continue to see. And what can we do? And what can we do in terms of putting a resource in people's hands? So in that moment's notice that they know, oh my God, I have to leave immediately. Could they use this technology? And so it's going to be an app, and we're working on that. But we're also providing resources. And so we provided, wrote a resource last year called Know Your Rights, Title IX, protection for LGBTQ+ families with students in the school system. And it's really helping parents understand how to navigate a very difficult environment. And we also have a Title IX claim link on our website that'll walk you through how to actually submit a Title IX claim. And then lastly, we're looking at this from a community spaces perspective. So because of how dire things are, what we're hearing from families and students is that they want community now more than ever. And they need kind of a reprieve from the hate that they see in the schools, their community. So we are providing virtual community spaces as well as in-person community spaces. For example, I'm in New York because we're doing something called Incredible on Sunday, and that's bringing 200 or so LGBTQ+ families, and that includes, when we say that, we include straight-led families, all to Chelsea Piers, to a bowling alley to have fun, to sort of forget about what's going on, to have this reprieve, because we do think part of fighting the legislation is also talking about the joy. And I like what you just said, Emily, that it's not all doom and gloom. And so we are being really mindful that, yes, we got to fight the legislation. Yes, we got to talk about the bad bills. We got to talk about all those things, but people are needing hope and joy. And so we're doing that. And one other thing we're doing from a virtual community space is that we just created a new peer support space for the education front. That's for parents to meet every couple of weeks and talk about how do we navigate what's going on in the education space? What are you going through in Texas versus what are you going through in Massachusetts, et cetera, and sort of brain share best practices and link some of the issues, and it also allows us to problem solve.
Wow, family equality is incredible, doing such cool work. We similarly at ACLU, we're working on multiple fronts in the legislature. So whether that's advocacy in the state legislature through our state level affiliates, one of our tools that I had nothing to do with, so I will brag about it forever, I'm popping it in the chat, is we have a tracker that we are sort of real-time tracking all of the bills that are attacking LGBTQ rights to help sort of raise awareness and educate folks. And then also we're providing sort of resources to support people in pushing back against those laws in their state and local communities, which I'll talk a little bit more about those resources later. But also, again, like family equality, it takes a village. We're fighting in the courts as well. So some examples are right now in Indiana, there's been an ongoing case that ACLU is working on against a school district for barring a trans boy from using the boys' bathroom. We recently joined a lawsuit that's suing Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference for not allowing trans athletes to play sports according to their gender. We filed a federal case against Missouri School District on behalf of students claiming books had been removed from school libraries because of LGBTQ or racial content. And we're also suing Florida as well on behalf of educators and students against the Stop Woke Act, which is the one that prohibits or limits learning and talking about issues related to race and gender in higher education classrooms. One of the things also that we're really focusing on now at ACLU is not just the legal courts, but the court of public opinion, really working to disrupt the narrative of our opposition and to normalize, destigmatize LGBTQ folks and combat the Sphere campaign. I think we as a movement need to do a better job of making our case to the court of public opinion. So one example we have is a Right to Learn campaign that sort of helps raise awareness about what these book bans and other kind of curriculum bans are doing and the dangers of that. And also, I just want to really echo what Jaymes was sort of ending with about the importance of us celebrating trans joy and trans freedom. And that's one thing that ACLU is also working on right now, is developing some new work to help us do that, to counteract those narratives that are so damaging, not only in terms of policy, but we know that research has showed us, even if these laws don't pass, and we all know this, right? Like just the fact that they're out there and people are debating individuals like right to exist has a huge impact on youth. So we're thinking about it in all those ways.
Stephanie, did you want to chime in or?
Oh, just really quickly, because this is something that I didn't hear mentioned, but I found it to be really a good strategy. I think most of us know that a lot of this legislation that we've been referencing is by and large prepackaged. And that's why you see it being duplicated, a carbon copy almost across various states. And so one thing that that has been pretty effective when possible, and I do want to accentuate that it's not always possible, but when possible, meeting with the authors of these bills before they go into law, because what we find a lot of times is that they've been handed these drafts of legislation, and many times they're invested in the political optics that those bills offer. They're not necessarily even giving a great deal of thought to the implications and the unintended consequences of those bills going into law. And so a number of times there have been success stories of these bills basically dying and never going into effect as law, including in states like Alabama, Florida, Texas, etc. Because conversations, when possible, with the legislators who are credited as authors, oftentimes they'll say, "Well, we don't want so anti-CRT bills, like we don't want white kids to feel excluded. Anti-LGBTQ plus bills, well, we don't want boys using the girls' bathroom." And it's a great deal of the talking pieces that you hear in dominant media, and conversations with them about the ways that their concerns are not reality can sometimes be useful in either defanging the legislation before it does go into effect, or just kind of frankly stalling the legislation and it doesn't go into effect. And so I do want to acknowledge that's not always possible, but I've seen that work in multiple settings at both the local and the state level. And part of that's just because a lot of this legislation isn't actually being authored by the people who are putting it forward. And so having conversations with them when that's available can be really productive.
So helpful, incredibly helpful. Okay, so moving on, how do book bans targeting LGBTQ content in schools impact the educational experience for both LGBTQ plus students and their peers, as well as LGBTQ parents, teachers, and administrators?
I'll hop in really quickly. So I used to be an English teacher. And so if any of you don't know the Ray Bradbury book, Fahrenheit 451, really quickly, it's a book where basically books are banned for the entirety of society and they're burned publicly. And the reason I bring that up is because this question, my mind immediately went to a situation in Alabama that happened last year. There was a trans affirming passage in the DAP. It's developmentally appropriate pedagogy for early grades education. And it's used nationally in pre-K and early grades programs. The state of Alabama, there wasn't a bill passed, there wasn't a law passed. What happened was the governor's office decided that this book would not be used. And there were several problems with that. The first and foremost, the previous edition was out of print. It wasn't available, and frankly, some of the information was incorrect at this point because time had moved on. But what happened was after the governor's office decided that this book was not allowable because of this trans affirming content, agents from the governor's office quite literally drove around the state and collected the books. And so I think a lot of times when we're thinking about book bans, we think about what's happening in large scale across the nation where we have appointed councils that review books and decide wholesale for schools. We have parental rights and parental choice that in effect prevent other parents from having choice for their students, et cetera. But that's always what comes to mind immediately for me when we talk about book banning is like the literal collection of books that are not allowable. And the last thing that I will add relative to that, so there's a lot of discussion in reading literature, reading scholarship, this idea of windows, doors, and sliding doors. And what that means is one of the reasons that we are obligated to present diversity in the texts that students are presented, fiction and nonfiction, is because windows allow children to see into the lives and the perspectives and the experiences of people who are not like them, which can be very useful and humanizing for a range of reasons. Doors are important because you're able to open, into new possibilities, new access. But sliding doors, you in effect move the door out of the way. You open a passage that connects you. And what's happening with these book bans relative to your question, Abbie, is that the sliding doors have been locked. And that's the effect. And so what's happening, and Emily was referencing earlier a lot of the statistics, and then Jaymes referenced earlier the Hatred in the Hallway study that was at this point decades old, as the kids will say, which is infuriating and a little upsetting. But what ends up happening is that it's perpetuating those very issues because now there aren't ways for youth and teachers who do not exist in ways that are queer and trans affirming to be able to understand and humanize those issues. And then for youth and teachers that are LGBTQ plus identifying people, they don't have any representation. There's been an erasure of self in classroom spaces. And so those are some of the biggest issues. I will say that, because I do appreciate Emily's point about like not making it all doom and gloom. I think that's really important. That there are a range of, especially librarians, if any of you in the audience are librarians, like you are doing some hardcore work out there, and teachers too, but there's a lot of work on the parts of especially public libraries as much as possible, school libraries as much as possible with zero budget, trying to create spaces where at minimum teachers and kids have access, like even if it's not in the classroom space, they have access. And so there's really important work happening in the gray spaces and the liminal spaces. But there's some very serious and scary dystopian realities that are happening relative to book banning.
Oh, gosh, it's gonna make me reread Fahrenheit 51. Just to sort of add on in terms of thinking about the types of books that are being challenged. And also, by the way, these challenges, I think you mentioned this, Abbie, like they're very organized, right? For the most part, they are not just like a parent here and a parent there who's concerned. It's sort of organized pushback with templates for what to say and how to look at this. So it's very organized. We could sort of take a page from their mobilization. But I wanted to say that, like, obviously, most of us know that LGBTQ themed books have been on the top of challenged children's and young adult books for over a decade, often in the #1 spot. In recent years, we're seeing more and more books being challenged for racial content as well. According to the Children's Cooperative Book Center, which is at University of Madison, Wisconsin, they've been tracking this for years. And they found that among children's books in general, not just LGBTQ specific, but in general, children of color see themselves represented not only less than a fifth often as white children, but less often than animal characters. And that's staggering, right? So those windows and mirrors that are not being shown. And even among LGBTQ inclusive books specifically, like BIPOC characters, characters with disabilities, immigrant characters, particularly main characters, are sorely lacking. Some research is pointing to some promising trends, particularly in some of the graphic novels and young adult literature, but we can't be complacent. I also want to say that I think it's critical that the representation is diverse, not only in identities, but also in stories that are being told. That's sort of been mentioned here. Are all the stories sort of focused on certain types of gender expression or LGBTQ plus identities as being the central problem to be solved? Or do we also showcase loving, accepting families and communities from the start, not just the resolution of the book? And do we include LGBTQ representation in sort of everyday kinds of stories? So it's not necessarily central, but just one facet of who they are. Just to be clear, like those stories about discrimination and victimization are important. And obviously that still happens today, but we need all types of stories and not just the victim narrative, or now sometimes it's the hero narrative, right? But we need, I think, to do a lot more work on the everyday person narrative. But these book bans are pushing against that as well.
Powerful examples. Thank you. Okay. So how can educators navigate discussions about LGBTQ issues in the classroom, considering this current legal landscape and potential community pushback?
I'm happy to jump in. So first, I'll talk a little bit about what educators can do, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how to find common ground to navigate these issues with parents and administrators. So first, I think it's important, and this has already been mentioned, to know what your rights are as an educator. It's important for students to know what their rights are, and it's also important to know who your allies are, both within your school and your community. And ultimately, I think it's also important to acknowledge that while we can't control the decisions made by state legislatures, we can decide how we, parents, educators, community members, choose to show up for LGBTQ plus youth, because part of the strategy that's being used is one that's intended to sow confusion. So people don't know, okay, I don't know if I'm going to get fired. I don't know like what the consequences are. I don't know what my rights as an educator are. And so they just don't do anything, right? And then as Stephanie was saying, then everybody loses. So knowing that, and ACLU has really fantastic resources for that, as does Lambda Legal and other organizations. The truth is too that LGBTQ plus students are paying attention to what's happening politically, and that the anti-LGBTQ plus legislation and rhetoric that they're hearing is having a significant impact on their mental health. So really the most important thing that you can do is to counter that rhetoric with affirmation, validation, and support. The impact of supportive adults can't be overstated. And so that's really the most important thing. And to that end, it's important to be intentional and proactive about cultivating classroom and school environments that are welcoming and inclusive, not waiting for a crisis to happen and then trying to navigate a discussion without that rapport and that respectful classroom environment that's so important. And so really taking the time and being intentional about creating those spaces are important so that, one, students know that they can have these kinds of conversations in your classrooms, again, depending on sort of what state you live in and what your limitations are. Two, that the exchange that you're having with students is honest and respectful. And three, so that students know that they can show up every day as exactly who they are in your classroom and be embraced and valued. And I think another thing that's really important is just finding ways to integrate and normalize LGBTQ plus representation and affirm LGBTQ plus people in ways that take into account the current legal and political landscape, right? And Stephanie already mentioned the importance of windows and mirrors. So finding those opportunities is really important. And we see through research that the more LGBTQ plus people are representing, that leads to prejudice reduction. So that's really critical. And then I also wanted to touch on briefly just the importance of finding common ground, especially in today's political climate. It's necessary to find some sort of common ground so we can have an entry point to dialogue. And it really, I found it's not as difficult as we think, especially when it comes to working with educators and parents. So a big part of my work is facilitating trainings, and I've done so, across urban, suburban, and rural communities in the United States, in Latin America, where people come to these trainings, at different levels of awareness and experience. But one thing I do, depending on the audience, is at the beginning of the training, I ask them to either disagree or agree with the following statement. And the statement is, I believe all students deserve to feel respected, supported, and included. And I've done that exercise a number of times, more times than I can count. And in every instance, they all agree with that. And that's really the common ground that we all share. And it's a really important entry point for dialogue, especially because if the conversation ever gets derailed, as it often does, you can always circle back to that shared belief, which is the idea that all youth should feel supported, respected, and included. And that's really what the work is all about, right? Educators don't come to this work because it's lucrative. It's because fundamentally they care about the well-being of youth. And I believe that to be true, despite what their ideology, their political ideology is, what their religious affiliation is. And parents want the best for their kids as well. So if we can find that common ground, and if we can use that as an entry point for dialogue, I find that that's been really successful. And then another quick point is I find that focusing on belonging, which is really a building block toward thriving, is something that people tend to connect with. Belonging is a fundamental human need. It's right after safety and physiological needs on Maslow's pyramid. And it's a concept that people can typically relate to, even if they check all of the privilege boxes. It also helps, focusing on belonging helps LGBTQ plus youth. It helps all youth thrive. And when people recognize that supporting and affirming LGBTQ plus benefits all youth, that's also an important point, right? That there's this tendency to say, oh, you're giving special treatment to LGBTQ plus youth. But in reality, if we create welcoming, affirming, and inclusive spaces, that benefits everyone.
Yeah. And I completely agree. Those are all of the things that we also recommend doing. I want to acknowledge that for teachers, learning what the legal landscape is complicated, and it's more complicated now than it has been in the past. And it's a lot of extra work for an educator, because this isn't packaged somewhere where they can just, you know, look something up and it says, oh, well, this law is conflicting with this law. And there are some resources, but it is harder and harder to navigate. They have to think about the district, the school board, the state, the federal policy, and all the parameters that they need to work within across those, and there may not be consistency around those expectations. So it's important to know what protections you do have, and then to be able to contextualize those. So, for example, there can be state policy on the books that technically offers protections, like the LGBT enumerated Arkansas anti-bullying law, but that law was never implemented with attention to enumeration. And now there are more recent contradictory policies in that state. So likewise with Title IX, the US Department of Education has issued guidance, and some states are actively resisting that guidance. So if educators are taking risks with their curriculum and pedagogy, it is important that they take informed risks and know that policy and local landscape, and understand you know, where those contradictions are and the kind of space they have to operate in. And, you know, then that hope for common ground, you know, this takes me back in some ways to doing this work in the early part of my career in the, you know, early 2000s, where that was, you know, finding that consensus statement was the work that we did to bring everyone to the table to start the ball rolling. And, you know, we would say, what are the declarations that provide the broadest consensus? So all children have the right to an education, or all students have the right to a safe learning environment. It's the school's responsibility to support a supportive learning environment for everybody, or students should not be bullied, and try to gain the widest community buy-in from all stakeholders to a really simple consensus statement, and then build around that. And also, if we need to step back into primary reliance on risk reduction strategies, such as anti-bullying programs, we can do it more effectively than in the past by focusing on school culture and not just on intervention with individual aggressors. I think it is possible to do a lot of good work with an anti-bullying approach that addresses school culture as a prevention tool for bullying and harassment, and that work can start in a teacher's classroom. And I also want to add that obviously, this work has always been dependent on local cultures, but the considerations are so much more complex now. And I think building educator support networks and opportunities for educators to safely share localized practices will be helpful for sustaining teacher allies and advocates. And those outside the school can also, you know, in advocacy, and parent organizations can also take a role in trying to help create those spaces for teachers to come together and share what's going on, and to help and support one another.
Thank you so much. Our next question, if what support systems can be put in place in schools to help LGBTQ students who may be experiencing heightened bullying or harassment?
Yes. So I didn't mention this in my intro, but I'm a former school counselor. I worked at the elementary school level and middle school and high school, actually, in the state of Georgia. So I'm familiar with that deep South work that Stephanie was talking about. And I can say unequivocally, although this is a biased opinion, that schools should hire more counselors. The American School Counselor Association recommends a caseload of 250 students per counselor, but in reality, the vast majority of school counselors have 2, 3, even 4 times that amount. We also know that teachers are overworked, especially after the pandemic. Teachers are leaving the field in droves. And so this creates an environment that doesn't allow for the sort of proactive, intentional efforts required to effectively prevent and address bullying and harassment, because, you know, teachers and school counselors are only have time to put out fires, right? And to act and not to be proactive. So too often schools wait for a crisis to respond rather than focusing on prevention, especially when they don't have the resources and personnel. So it's important, I think, first and foremost, to hire more counselors, support staff, and teachers as needed. It's also important to regularly review and enforce existing anti-bullying and harassment policies and advocate for a stronger, more inclusive policy if one is needed. So often educators don't know what's even in their district's anti-bullying and harassment policy. They have no idea, right? So even if you have a really strong anti-bullying and harassment policy, but no one knows what's in it and it's not enforced, then it's just about as good as the paper that it's written on, right? So a lot of educators, since they don't know what's in their policy, it hasn't been enforced, they don't do anything when they witness bullying and harassment because they're afraid of doing or saying the wrong thing. And so the only way to change that is with professional development. And aside from professional development, I know some schools have had success distributing a school climate survey to students just to give staff an idea of what the needs are and where and how they should respond, right? So if they know, that there's an issue with, maybe some bullying and harassment during, PE class or something like that, they can look into it and respond, take a more targeted approach in the response. And schools should also consider establishing a school climate committee or something similar to that, where they can continuously think about implementing proactive strategies to foster a welcoming environment and reduce the likelihood of bullying and harassment. And students should be encouraged to participate on these sorts of committees, right? Students are the real experts. They're the ones who will be most impacted by any changes to practices and protocols. So really seeking and integrating their perspectives is very important. And then finally, focusing on restorative rather than punitive practices is a more effective way to address bullying behavior and reduce the likelihood of recurrence.
Thank you so much for that. And I don't know if you want to just jump into the next question, which is for you and Jaymes, what are some of the resources that you would recommend, key resources for LGBT youth, parents, and or school personnel?
I'm happy to jump in really quick. I know Dr. Beeman compiled a comprehensive list of helpful resources, which my understanding is participants will be receiving. I encourage everyone to check that out. I do want to mention a couple of others. So most resources, when we talk about supporting LGBTQ plus youth, and a lot of the resources that exist and the research that exists tend to focus on middle and high school aged youth. And so I wanted to highlight a couple related specifically to supporting LGBTQ plus youth at the elementary school level. And one is Welcoming Schools, which was created by the Human Rights Campaign. And another is Ready, Set, Respect, which is a toolkit created by GLSEN. I also wanted to share the names and organizations that instead of one sort of resource, there are a lot of organizations that do great work. And if you visit their website, they have a wealth of different resources, and that includes GLSEN, the ACLU, Lambda Legal, the Gender and Sexuality Network, GSA Network. Learning for Justice is great for integrating LGBTQ plus affirming content into your curriculum, and the Trevor Project. And in terms of parents, the Family Equality Council, of course, PFLAG, the Human Rights Campaign, Trans Youth and Family Allies. And then Somos Familia has Spanish language resources for parents, caregivers, and loved ones as well. And then finally, I recommend checking out local resources too, such as LGBTQ plus centers in your community.
And I'll just add a little to that. Thanks for the shout out, Maru. If you go to familyequality.org and go to our schools page, we have many resources on how to navigate the school climate. I mentioned the Know Your Rights Title IX report that we published last year. Again, that is helping LGBTQ plus led households who have children in the school system and how to navigate that. We also published a report with GLSEN and Collage last year on school climate. That's also at the page on that page. And as far as school personnel could look at the National Education Association, NEA, their guidelines for creating welcoming, empowering schools. And that's also linked on our schools resource page at familyquality.org. And then for parents, there's an organization, a grassroots organization that we just became aware of called Red, Wine, and Blue. And they can help parents with resources and training. And then, as Maru said, there's Trevor Project, there's GLSEN, and those types of organizations are really focused on the student experience. And I highly recommend those are our partners and recommend their information and resources.
Great, thank you so much. So the next question is kind of big and it's kind of a two-parter. What advocacy efforts can be undertaken by educators, parents, and community members to promote a more inclusive and affirming educational environment for LGBT individuals in the face of restrictive legislation? And really what can be done right now to support LGBT youth in schools? What creative avenues can folks, teachers, school staff, and so on take to empower and sustain LGBT youth? What strategies can they use?
Okay, I can start on that one. So if we're going to talk about supporting youth in hostile states, then we have to think about what's possible within the law and how to creatively use that. So for example, pedagogy is intended to expand opportunities for girls, have a really long history. Messages we very commonly see in elementary schools, like girls can be doctors and boys can be nurses. They are actually useful if they're consistent and if they're nurtured and if they extend beyond a poster. Privileging gender conformity, whether it's intentional or unintentional or unexamined bias, these all limit possibilities for students, and challenging that opens up possibilities for all students. So work done to challenge sexist stereotyping is work against gender policing, and gender policing is the most common form of LGBTQ harassment. So while attacks on women and girls are occurring right along with those on LGBTQ people, the basic argument that girls should be provided opportunity to achieve without sex-based restriction still holds in public schools. So openly and consistently challenge limiting stereotypes. And then learn about your district and state anti-bullying policies, read the actual laws and read the regulations, and compare what's happened in your school to the expectations that are laid out in the policy, and also compare what's happened in your school to best practices for addressing school culture and bullying, and then pitch your school and your district to do more. That might mean taking on the design of an initiative and willingness to find and create the resources to do it. In most schools, anti-bullying policy has not been implemented with fidelity, and arguing against improving anti-bullying efforts is a difficult position to take. And then of course, GSAs, we know they have a positive impact for some students, and they're largely protected by the Equal Access Act. So if your school doesn't have one, start one. Make sure in the starting of one, you're working to create an inclusive space that is comfortable for kids across race and gender and various kinds of sexual identities and abilities. And I'll stop there.
I can add to that. So just to reiterate what I mentioned before, being supportive, right, showing up, affirming and validating LGBTQ plus youth and their experiences is incredibly important, especially if LGBTQ plus youth come from homes where they're not getting that support, and it might be that the only place that they're getting that support is at school. It's even more important. And as I said before, finding some sort of common ground, working with colleagues to identify a communication strategy, right? So there are things that we know that are effective in communicating why it's so important to support LGBTQ plus youth, and there are resources out there to help guide that sort of communication strategy and sort of identifying key talking points to make sure that the conversation doesn't get derailed, because if you're not careful, the conversation can get derailed quickly. And so that intentionality is important. Knowing who your allies are, working together and leaning on each other for support, especially in this political climate, is paramount. Encourage professional development around issues like school climate. We know how important professional development is. And, working with community organizations that are, maybe a little bit more on the conservative side, I've had to sort of shift the way that I frame trainings, right? So, for example, instead of, supporting LGBTQ plus youth, it could be something like a professional development training about improving the school climate or something like that, right? Cultivating more welcoming schools, addressing issues of bullying and harassment, right? Which, while not ideal, ultimately what's more important is to get people in the room to start having those conversations. So figuring out what the framing could look like to get more people at the table. I think it's really important when it comes to issues like this to focus on the movable middle, right? There are people who are never going to agree with you. There are people who are always going to agree with you. And then there are a big chunk of people in the middle who are open, right? And I think often we spend too much time preaching to the choir, which is important, right? Sometimes the choir needs practice, and sometimes the choir needs to learn how to work together and to sing together. But we also kind of have to figure out, like, there's a broad array of people in the middle who we can reach with the right messaging. And then advocating at the local, state, and national level for LGBTQ plus affirming policies and legislation, and finding ways to support LGBTQ youth in your school and support and community, as was mentioned before, like supporting your school's gender and sexuality alliance if one exists.
And I just want to add on a couple things that piggyback off those sort of organizing and advocacy standpoint. I couldn't agree more, and I'm sharing a resource in the chat around the importance of showing up locally at school board meetings, writing letters to the editor, making your voice heard. There's a toolkit there that provides templates and organizing tools and questionnaires and talking points, et cetera, that can be useful for folks. Also, I think the value of aligning and collaborating with those working for racial justice in school, that always goes without saying, but particularly now, we know the attacks are coming from the same place. And so showing up for those who are advocating for racial justice and working to stop those bans as well. And then lastly, I would say that, I might be a broken record, but we can't just remain on the defense. Like, we don't want to just let folks win on their terms. They're trying to roll back progress, and we have to do everything to guard against that, but it's not enough. If all we do is stop their efforts to roll back progress, then we're stuck right where we started years later. We're distracted from making the more progress that is like desperately needed. So we can't just like push back against efforts to ban LGBTQ inclusion or criminalize trans youth, but we need to like push forward for intersectional, authentic, and integrated inclusion that doesn't just tell that one single story, doesn't flatten LGBTQ youth or people's experiences, but shows like full complex humanity. And I would say if our inclusion is only white, cisgender, able-bodied, gay, and lesbians, instead of a true reflection of our communities like BIPOC, trans, non-binary, pansexual, asexual, it's not true inclusion. So instead of like individual hero worship, we need to be teaching about the power of collective action and collective movements instead of only victim narratives or representations of at-risk youth. We need representations of queer and trans joy and success. And we need to shift the focus, in my opinion, from seeing LGBTQ youth as broken, needing to be fixed, to seeing that our structures and systems are broken and need to be reformed. So we can't just put back, we just have to push forward, and we can't hold our ground only. We need to like take more ground.
Okay, and then I think we'll do one more question, then we'll have time for Q&A. Great questions coming in through the Q&A, and soon I'll be fed my chosen list of questions. So what actions would you like to see from policymakers on the state and federal level that would make schools more supportive spaces for LGBTQ students?
So I've actually been talking with and meeting with legislators for the past several weeks. And so this is not a hypothetical. This is quite literally my response to this question. First and foremost, what I would like for them to do is stop using prepackaged legislation. That's one of the biggest issues, because every time we sit down and have conversations with them, they don't even know what's in the bills, except for like what's in that summary section at the very beginning. They don't actually know what the legal implications would be of it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I would love to see them author legislative proposals that are research informed, and are actually being drafted in conversation with a diversity of parents, guardians, teachers, youth. Right now, a lot of times if parents and or teachers and or guardians or youth are involved at all, it's people who are politically affiliated with that legislator and their bent. And so you have, for example, someone drafting like an anti-trans bill that's talking with Moms for Liberty, for example. And that's just an echo chamber. And so one of the things I'd really like is for them to have conversations with a greater swath of just humans, to have a better understanding of the unintended consequences and potentially even the intended consequences of the bills that they're proposing. I'd like for them to stop. Right now, I feel like there's this heavy, I hate to use the term, but there's this like heavy fire of legislation. Like Emily talked earlier today about like all just the enormous numbers of bills and laws that are rolling out, and the sheer volume is absurd, and just speaks to the degrees to which there isn't a whole lot of careful thought. It's just it's a mass production, and I would love for them to stop and take stock of the current landscape and the effects that landscape is having on things that they care about, like the teacher shortage, youth being unsafe, youth truancy, whatever. And then the two other things, these are my last two things that come to mind immediately. I would like for higher education, this is not the legislature specifically, but I would like for higher education to be more directly involved in collaborating with and leveraging resources with K-12. Because a lot of these bills, what ends up happening, you see it over and over again in multiple states, is the bills will start off being higher education and K-12, and then ultimately what you'll see is that higher education part will drop away, and it's because higher education universities are leveraging resources that K-12 spaces simply do not have. And so higher education is insulating itself from a lot of the really insidious aspects of these bills becoming law, when there really should be some collaboration and some resource sharing. A lot of the question and answer sections are asking, well, what do we do about teacher education? What do we do in our classrooms? And part of the problem is that universities are frankly operating in pretty myopic ways, and not really being attentive to the ways that that focusing on higher education specifically is not only harming K-12, but is harming universities' abilities to work with and to serve K-12. And the last thing that I would add is that what I wish for these legislators is that they would understand that there are humans on the receiving ends of these laws and these bills. That's, I think, the biggest part of it. I think that a lot of these bills, when I sit down and talk to these legislators, they seem almost to be like thought exercises, or their political theater, and there isn't a whole lot of attention or realization that as they're pushing these bills through and they're getting their sound bites, on social media, there are human beings on the receiving end whose lives are materially changed in profound ways, and they always seem really shocked by that notion. And often find themselves backpedaling when that starts to become a realization for them. So if it's a wish list, if wishes were fishes, that's what I wish would happen with legislators.
Okay. So I work in New York State, And that's a very different kind of climate than the one that Stephanie is in. So I think, my actions for policymakers, I think are a good juxtaposition to what she's talking about, because there is still so much to do, even in states that on the surface, are supportive of LGBTQ students. And this is just a quick list, and a lot of this is kind of coming out of my own research. I've been doing state policy now for LGBT kids in New York State for over 15 years or something like that. So many states' anti-bullying laws are unfunded mandates. And I'd like to see funding streams established to support implementation. It's often the unfunded laws where there are stipulations for educator professional development around diversity issues, including LGBTQ issues. So in states that require PD, it's not happening widely, or it's low quality because it's attached to these unfunded mandates. States that have LGBTQ inclusive education law may not have state departments of education that are willing to issue clear guidance on implementation, and districts rely on state departments of ed to translate law into action steps. And without those action steps, they may not actually act. So state departments of ed need to increase their competence and comfort with addressing LGBTQ issues and providing that translation from law into guidance and action steps. State requirements for teacher ed programs to address the needs of diverse student populations are often vague, and they may not name LGBTQ youth. States that claim to be supportive of LGBTQ students need to prepare educators to do that work. Sex education in many states is not required, and if it is required, it is not required to be medically accurate or LGBTQ inclusive. And a surprising number of health teachers report they don't have the content knowledge to teach about HIV, even in states where HIV instruction is required. So we need medically accurate sex education, LGBTQ inclusive sex education, and health teachers that are prepared to teach it. Several states are trying to ban the book bans, both in schools and public libraries. You've seen these laws going around, and they can help reduce the momentum for banning efforts and also provide some relief to librarians. And then I spent the past year working in the US House of Representatives on education policy. And at the federal level, we need to all pay attention to what's going on in the congressional education committees. Right now, the attacks on LGBTQ youth are posturing, but it's important to see what bills are passing in the House and pay careful attention to that language, because if control of the executive and the Senate shift, it could become very quickly a very different situation. And I don't think enough people are paying attention to that.
Thank you all so much. And as you can see, there's wonderful questions coming in the chat and a lot of appreciation and enthusiasm. So moving to a couple of these questions, and feel free, everyone, as we kind of move through these, if there's specific questions that you want to respond to, panelists, you can do that as well. So the first question is, are any of you, or does anyone know how university professors of education are being educated on these issues to teach our future teachers? And if anyone has any resources for this.
I can just share a resource and share a little bit of knowledge. Recently, GLSEN and the Association of Teacher Education released a national study that they did. And basically, in pre-service education and like graduate schools and things like that, less than a third of teachers said that they actually got any content on LGBTQ youth issues, populations, teaching anything. And when people do get the content, it's generally less likely to be about trans youth than queer LGBT youth, as we probably all could guess. And also, lessons about curriculum is very low. So even for teachers, when they are learning about LGBTQ people, they're learning about how do you intervene sometimes, or just general like experiences that LGBTQ, those things are all really important. But the point is that in-service and pre-service, people are not being taught how to teach LGBTQ inclusion, which couldn't be more important at this moment.
I
And
would
just,
add,
sorry, go ahead, Stephanie. You
please
can.
go ahead. Please go ahead.
I was just going to mention that often too, it's rather than it being sort of integrated throughout their development, right? It's like a one-off, like, okay, today we're going to learn about this, and then we're going to check that box, and then we're never going to revisit it again, right? And rather than really focusing on the skill building, it's just like, okay, here's some information to build knowledge, right? Like some basic terms and things like that, but it's not very substantive.
Yeah.
What I
And
was gonna, I'm sorry.
go ahead,
What-
Stephanie.
What I was going to add briefly is that accreditation requirements can be very useful in pushing for this sort of training and education. So I'm operating from the mindset and looking at some of the Q&A. Some of you are in spaces where you describe not knowing how to even get this started, not knowing how to convince people that this is important to do, because everything that my colleagues have said is exactly right. There isn't nearly enough. But I think a lot of times administrators, deans, teacher educator program coordinators are fearful of doing this work too. And one of the things that I found really useful in terms of a tool to get people to mobilize and do is pointing to things like accreditation standards, certification standards, national organization standards. And so my background again is English, and so the National Council of Teachers of English have enormous numbers of resources related to how LGBTQ plus affirming work is important and necessary. And so that's useful both in giving practical materials, language, resources, but also in pointing to very concrete reasons as to why we're obligated to do this work and need to do it well.
Yeah. And so often when practicing teachers are receiving professional development on these issues, sometimes it's actually being delivered by a school attorney, and it's being presented as these are the ways that you won't get sued, for violating the rights of students, or not recognizing and respecting them. And when we do professional development in schools and teachers come to us, they say, I've been teaching for 5 years, 10 years, my education program didn't teach me anything about this. And they want that information. So I think that I think schools of education often underestimate the degree to which teachers want to be equipped and want to feel knowledgeable about how to teach in support of LGBTQ students.
Great. Second question is, in areas that are anti-queer or the local government is anti-queer, how do you initiate support systems and advocacy for LGBTQ youth in school? Any thoughts?
I'm thinking about an example of when we lived in Texas. And what my wife did is start joining there were school committees, and she was the only LGBTQ plus person on the committee. She was the only Black person on the committee, but her aim was that she knew that the administration didn't even want to say the word lesbian or say gay, and that for her, even though it was I think uncomfortable at times, she felt that sort of inserting herself in there and talking about the issues and being an advocate for the children was something that she could offer. And she also found allies in the neighborhood that she could also work with that would also join the committee with her. So I'd say that sometimes you have to sort of find your allies and find people who are aligned with you, even though the government, et cetera, local maybe anti-LGBTQ plus, and start mobilizing people. And that's the way that she did it. It's not comfortable all the time, but I think that's one way to do it.
I can give a personal example as well. When I worked as a school counselor, I worked in Newt Gingrich's former congressional district. If any of you remember who Newt Gingrich was, you can imagine. But the school district that I worked is the second largest school district in the state of Georgia, the second largest school district in the United States. And at the time, we had a very weak anti-bullying and harassment policy with no enumerated categories that that included, sexual orientation, gender identity, but also didn't include things like race, religion, spirituality, ability, etc. And so what we ended up doing is we mobilized, right? It was youth from the Gay Straight Alliance. And then we started partnering with other people who would benefit from a stronger anti-bullying harassment policy as well. And we ended up going to the school board meetings. Every month they had school board meetings. They have 30 minutes for public comments. You have to sign up. You have 2 minutes to make comments. So we brought more people each time. And until the entire 30-minute public comments was taken up by us, just talking about like bringing in data, but also telling stories, right? Like the importance, like data is important, but stories are also crucial, right? Change happens in the stories that we tell. And so we kept just going back, being persistent. Finally, one of the school board members agreed to meet with us, and we were able to change the anti-bullying harassment policy in our school district, and that ultimately became the anti-bullying and harassment policy or the model policy for the state of Georgia. So a lot of school districts ended up adopting it by default. And so I think it takes persistence, and if you organize, if you mobilize, if you have the right messaging, then you can move the needle forward, even in in places that perhaps are more resistant and hostile.
I'm going to add really quickly. The question is about local government being hostile. And so when I was a high school teacher, a pastor complained to the superintendent about me. And it was a situation where he had a great deal of local power, to the point of being able to just text the superintendent and like drop my name as a problem. And so if you are truly in an extremely hostile local context, understand that you don't have to, like, your power doesn't necessarily come from that place, but it doesn't mean that you can't do this work in that place. And what I mean by that is like reaching outside of where you are, that is going to oppose this work. And so one of the best mechanisms I had were, for example, national organizations that I could point to for my principal and my superintendent and say, like, this is work that within my field, like professionals who do this work nationally are doing this work within my field. These are professional standards. Looking at like teacher certification standards that were a part of my certificate as being a teacher, and being like, these actions fall within the guidelines of what I'm doing as a certified teacher. The other thing is, so I don't work in unionized states, like unions aren't allowed, but there are professional organizations, and that was a really important resource to be able to leverage, because while the pastor was complaining and my job was kind of on the chopping block, I was able to reach out to these professional organizations that existed outside, again, of his local context, and get free legal advice, for example, get free resources. All of the different organizations that are represented here have free websites as well. And so I would say that if you are in an anti-queer local government space, reaching out, like, recognize there's a much larger community to leverage and access that can support you and even protect you in some cases.
Thank you so much. Next question is, and I think actually all of you could probably address this. Can you talk about any unmet research needs that you see being needed to help move forward policy change at this time?
Well, even, things that are really basic, you would think that we would have a lot of data on, and we don't necessarily have a lot of data on it. And part of that is there are lots of questions to ask, and there are not that many LGBT researchers if you compare to the vastness of experience that we're trying to capture. I just completed the first qualitative study of state anti-bullying law. It's a 10-year study of data collection and, looking around at other states. What do we know about enumeration? What do we know about the ways that having an enumerated law has helped LGBT students? Has it not? We actually don't know something as simple as that, because there just isn't that much studying on it. It's not that deep. And there's so many things that we don't know about the current political climate and how that's affecting the lives of students and teachers and communities. So that's opening up a whole new set of research questions that we need to get data on. I mean, I remember when I was in Congress last year, I was writing literature reviews. I called Abbie and said, what do you have that hasn't come out? Because I need staff to be able to build these arguments. So I think there's so many areas, and if you're interested in becoming an LGBT researcher, there's plenty for you to do.
I agree completely with Elizabeth, and also want to add on that I think when we're thinking about what research would move policy change, or what research is needed to do policy change, we also want to be thinking about, do we need messaging research to understand? There actually is a lot of messaging research out there on this, but maybe not in your specific area or your specific community, to know what messages are going to resonate and are going to move people and mobilize them to reach out to their constituent or their representatives, or what's going to move the representative, the policymaker themselves. I also think that there's a lot of research, well, not a lot, it is certainly relative, but there's been a growing amount of research on trans youth and on LGBTQ youth, and that is incredibly needed. But there is a lack of research on the systems themselves. And Elizabeth was just talking about some of the research that she's doing specifically around those structural pieces. And I think more of our attention needs to be put there so we can understand what is needed and why those things are broken and how can we fix them. And the last thing I'll say is that we also need research to understand what are the things that are going to move policymakers, not just message research. We know some of that in general, like poli-sci folks know some of that, but we need more people in doing poli-sci research specifically focused on these kinds of legislative and policy endeavors, I think.
I'll add a couple of things too. I think based on the conversation that we had earlier, teacher preparation, more research on teacher preparation, how institutions of higher education can better prepare teachers to support LGBTQ+ youth teachers and school counselors. I also think that more research is needed on supporting LGBTQ+ youth in elementary schools. Most of the research focuses on middle and high school. Rural communities, right? Most of the research tends to focus on urban areas and less so on rural communities. And then finally, community organizations outside of school, after school programs, extracurricular. 4-H, for example, is the largest youth serving organization in the United States. There's very, very little research on LGBTQ+ youth in 4-H. So certainly I echo what Elizabeth said. There's a lot of research to be done in this field.
Okay, this is a really important question. Do any of the panelists have experience or recommendations for advocating for LGBT inclusive education when it comes to private Catholic or Christian settings, where administration may view LGBTQ affirmative care and education is in conflict with the religious base of the school?
I just did training with a religiously affiliated middle school that has several transgender, nonconforming, and gender creative students. And the way that we approached it was not in relationship to religious doctrine and belief systems. Instead, we approached it very specifically. So, and this actually will answer some of the questions in the Q&A as well. Federal guidelines regarding Title IX have actually been upheld in courts to pertain to and protect trans people. And so pointing out how there are federal guidelines related to gender identity and gender expression being protected classes and then also using their own documentation as the basis for advocating for this work. Because this particular school was a Catholic school, and so they had a pretty robust statement regarding student safety and valuing students and dignity and humanity. And the saint that the school was named for was actually a saint that had been known for caring for the marginalized children in school spaces. And so I pointed out, that arguably the work that was being proposed to be done in that school not only helped protect youth, not only was well aligned with their documented policies and procedures, but it also arguably fit well within how they had structured themselves relative to their belief system and their saint namesake. And I'm not going to pretend like I'm not going to give you some sort of rose-colored glasses that there's some sort of magical epiphany across the entirety of the school, but I will say that there was a greater degree of buy-in from administrators, which matters a lot. By and large, the youth and the teachers were interested in doing this work, and the administrators were the ones that were like, well, we're going to upset our fundraising people and our sponsors and so on. And so it made it a lot easier for them to understand why they needed to do that work when we framed it relative to student safety, student dignity, their own belief systems relative to students' well-being, rather than making it about religion. And so that's one of the best strategies. It's not going to work all the time. It's not going to work for all the people. But it does move needles and move perceptions in useful ways at times.
I'll add real quickly, Tanya Callahan from Calgary has written extensively on this. She's got a book that's out on it. So if you understanding the phenomenon sometimes can help you choose what route to take to try and improve the situation, and it makes for great reading.
I think if there's no more responses, we'll have one more question. Any resources that you would recommend or that are particularly appropriate for middle grades, sort of in line with what you were saying, Maru, about less being available for elementary school and middle grade students, for teachers or for students? And I assume these are resources that are centered on LGBT inclusion.
So I'll say that GLSEN has the resources that they have are organized according to grade level, right? So they have resources for high school, resources for elementary school, resources for middle school, and Learning for Justice as well. If you're looking for curricular resources, those are also categorized according to grade level. So lots of great resources for middle school, through GLSEN and Learning for Justice.
Okay, thank you so much to our panelists, to our wonderful attendees. I just want to close by thanking everyone, reminding you that you will get a recording, some of the entries that are associated with these topics, as well as a resource list. And we're going to add a bunch of the resources that were listed in the chat, which are so helpful, and I'm sure we all want to keep those. We're going to add those we'll get those added to the resource list. And just a reminder that the next and the second and last panel will be on March 28th, same time, 7 to 8:30 Eastern, on trans resistance, resilience, and self-reliance, with another bunch of really great panelists. So I thank everyone so much for coming and bringing their best selves. And, we're all in deep gratitude to each other, I think, for our work on this, and we appreciate all the active and involved participation. So thank you.
Abbie and Jenny, thank you for coordinating and scheduling all the logistics. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you for Jenny. Hopefully Jenny will pop back on and just receive some of the gratitude that they deserve so fully. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great night.